Gabriel Daniels, the young and driven CEO of a successful beverage company called Daniels Beverages. Despite his ambitious career, his personal life felt incomplete. His wife, Priska, a popular social media influencer known for her beauty and motivational content, had a secret she had hidden from the public. She could not carry a child. Priska adored children, and for years, she begged Gabriel to adopt. "There are so many children who need loving homes," she would tell him. But Gabriel always resisted. "Priska," he said one evening as they sat in their elegant living room, "I understand your heart, but I want my own bloodline to continue. This company, my legacy, it's everything my parents worked for. I need a child that carries my DNA." Their disagreement caused a rift between them, but Gabriel's perspective changed when he was diagnosed with cancer at the height of his career. Knowing he might lose the ability to father children after surgery, he left a sperm sample at the hospital, hoping to secure his dream of becoming a father one day. Miraculously, his surgery was successful, and he beat cancer. Yet, the shadow of infertility hung over his life. Gabriel was eager to start a family, but Priska's health meant she couldn't conceive. When Priska suggested surrogacy as a compromise, Gabriel agreed. They found a willing egg donor, and the hospital began the surrogacy process. On the day of the procedure, chaos erupted at the hospital. A young college student named Jane Rivers had come for a routine medical checkup. In the confusion of a packed schedule, a doctor mistakenly inseminated Jane with Gabriel's sperm instead of the intended surrogate. The mistake was covered up by the hospital staff, who quietly deleted Jane's records to avoid liability. Meanwhile, Gabriel was informed that the surrogate was successfully pregnant. He was overjoyed, embracing Priska and sharing the news of their soon-to-be parenthood. Priska, however, masked her unease. While she had agreed to surrogacy to save their marriage, she feared that raising a child not biologically hers might strain their relationship further. Jane Rivers was a diligent college girl, juggling her studies and part-time work. Lately, she had been feeling fatigued and nauseous, which worried her. After a visit to the hospital for a checkup, she received a call from the nurse saying her results were ready. Curious but cautious, Jane decided to pick them up later that week. When she arrived at the hospital, she was greeted with a shocking revelation. "Congratulations, Miss Rivers, you're pregnant," the nurse said with a bright smile. Jane froze, staring at her in disbelief. "That's impossible," Jane said sharply. "I'm a virgin. You must have made a mistake." The nurse insisted the results were accurate and advised Jane to take it seriously. Refusing to believe it, Jane hurried out, determined to confirm it herself. Distraught and panicking, Jane stopped at a nearby pharmacy, bought a pregnancy test kit, and rushed into a restaurant bathroom to use it. Her hands trembled as she waited for the results. When 2 red lines appeared, confirming the pregnancy, her knees buckled, and the test slipped from her hand. How could this be true? She had never been with anyone. Meanwhile, Gabriel Daniels received a devastating news from the hospital. The surrogate he and his wife Priska had hired to carry their child had suffered complications, and the baby could not be saved. Gabriel, who had spent years longing to become a father, was shattered. His grief overwhelmed him, and unable to sit still, he decided to leave the office and head home. Jane, still reeling from the test results, stumbled out of the restaurant bathroom, clutching her bag tightly. She was so consumed by her thoughts that she barely noticed the sleek black car speeding down the street. The screech of brakes snapped her back to reality as she realized the car had narrowly missed hitting her. "What the hell is wrong with you?" Jane shouted, her voice trembling with fear and anger. Gabriel, stepping out of the car, looked startled but calm. "I'm sorry I didn't see you," he said, his deep voice laced with sincerity. Jane glared at him, still shaken, but something about his demeanor made her pause. As their eyes met, an unspoken tension filled the air. Gabriel's usually composed face softened as he noticed her teary eyes and trembling hands. For a moment, they both stood there, two strangers carrying their own burdens. Jane, overwhelmed by her emotions, brushed past him, muttering, "Just watch where you're going." Jane Rivers sat in her tiny dorm room, her hands trembling as she held her phone. Her childhood had been anything but normal, and now, at the cusp of adulthood, life had thrown her into chaos once again. She stared at Stephanie's last message on her phone. "You have to tell them, Jane. It's the only way to figure this out." Her heart pounded. How could she explain the impossible? How could a virgin be pregnant? Even Stephanie, her closest friend, had struggled to believe her, though she masked it with concern and kindness. Jane Rivers' family history was a tapestry woven with pain, love, and complicated relationships. Her mother, Elise, had grown up watching her own mother endure horrific abuse at the hands of Jane's grandfather, a ruthless politician who hid his violent tendencies behind a polished public image. Jane's grandmother, scarred physically and emotionally, passed away when Elise was only 12. Her death left a bitterness in Elise's heart that solidified her distrust of men. Determined to forge a different path, Elise found solace in the arms of a woman named Sarah, who became her lifelong partner. Together, they decided to have a child through a sperm donor, a man whose identity they chose to keep anonymous. To Jane, he was a phantom, someone who might not even know she existed. Her mothers never spoke of him, and she never asked. Jane's uncle, Jacob, was another reminder of the family's struggles. His life had taken a tragic turn when his wife, driven by paranoia, poured acid on him after falsely accusing him of infidelity. The truth emerged too late. It had been an innocent business trip. Scarred and battling health issues, Jacob was left to care for their two young children alone. The church, moved by his plight, had stepped in to support him, but his pain was palpable, etched into every line on his face. That night, Jane called her mother, Elise. The line crackled, and Elise's familiar voice brought a mix of comfort and dread. "Jane, is everything okay? You sound off," Elise said, concern laced in her tone. Jane hesitated. "Mom, I need to talk to you and the family. It's important." Elise paused, sensing the gravity in her daughter's voice. "All right, tomorrow morning. I'll call Jacob too." The next morning, Jane sat in the living room of her childhood home, surrounded by her family. Elise sat beside Sarah, their hands intertwined. Jacob sat across from her, his scarred face a silent testament to the pain he'd endured. His children played quietly in the corner, unaware of the storm brewing in the room. Jane took a deep breath. "I'm pregnant." The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. Elise blinked, her face a mix of disbelief and shock. "Pregnant? Jane? How? You've never even—" "I haven't," Jane interrupted, her voice cracking. "I swear, I've never been with a man. I don't know how this happened." The room fell silent. Sarah was the first to speak. "Jane, honey, that's not possible. There has to be an explanation." Jacob, who had remained quiet, finally spoke. "Jane, are you sure? Maybe you just don't remember." "I remember everything," Jane shouted, tears streaming down her face. "Why won't anyone believe me?" Elise's hands shook. Her mind raced back to her mother's suffering, her own mistakes, and now this. Her daughter, the one hope for a better legacy, standing before her with an impossible claim. She felt the weight of generations of pain crushing her chest. Sarah tried to soothe her. "Elise, calm down. Let's think this through rationally." But Elise couldn't. Her mind spiraled into despair. "This family is cursed. My mother was destroyed by a man. I chose a woman because I thought it would break the cycle, but here we are again, drowning in shame and confusion." Jacob's voice was low but firm. "This isn't about curses, Elise. Jane needs us now. We have to figure this out together." Jane looked at her uncle, gratitude and anguish swirling in her eyes. I don't know what to do. I don't even know where to start. Stephanie's words echoed in her mind. You have to tell them, Jane. She had done that, but now what? The room was a storm of emotions, anger, fear, disbelief, and love, all colliding at once. Jane Rivers moved into her parents' house, hoping they would care for her and help her through the difficult time she was facing. Her pregnancy was a mystery, and her parents were determined to find out who was responsible. Her best friend, Stephanie, visited her often, offering support and encouragement. At the same time, Gabriel Daniels was heartbroken. He had just learned that he would never have a biological child because his wife's womb couldn't carry a pregnancy. For Gabriel, having a child wasn't just about being a father. It was about having a child with his own DNA to continue his family's legacy, something that had been passed down through generations. Priska, his wife, didn't share his view. She was scared of the idea of surrogacy and didn't want to go through that process. Instead, she wanted them to adopt a child, hoping it would be enough for Gabriel. But Gabriel refused, as he was set on having a child that shared his DNA. Priska felt frustrated and helpless, knowing they couldn't agree. However, Priska's facade of concern cracked when she visited her best friend to complain about Gabriel's growing distance. Her friend reminded her that her behavior was partly to blame for the strain in their marriage. She even brought up Priska's past, recounting the abortions Priska had during their university days and implying that her lack of regard for Gabriel's happiness was hypocritical. Furious, this angered Priska, who lashed out at Sophia for not taking her side. Gabriel, still recovering from the loss of the surrogate pregnancy, sought solace in long, quiet walks through the park after work. It was on one of these evenings that he spotted Jane, sitting alone on a bench, her face shadowed with worry and exhaustion. Compelled by an inexplicable pull, Gabriel approached her. "Are you all right?" he asked softly, his deep voice startling Jane from her thoughts. Jane hesitated, unsure of how much to share with a stranger, but something in Gabriel's warm, empathetic tone broke through her defenses. "Not really," she admitted, staring at the ground. "It's been a tough few months." Gabriel nodded, taking a seat on the opposite end of the bench. "I get it," he said after a pause. "Life has a way of throwing curveballs when you least expect it." For the next hour, they shared fragments of their lives, not the whole truth, but enough to feel an odd sense of comfort in each other's presence. Jane spoke vaguely about her mysterious pregnancy and her fear of the unknown. Gabriel, in turn, opened up about his battle with cancer, his longing for a family, and the pain of his recent loss. They didn't exchange names, keeping their identities as anonymous as their secrets. "It's strange," Jane said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Talking to you feels easier than talking to my family." Gabriel smiled faintly. "Sometimes, it's easier to share with someone who doesn't know your whole story. No judgment, no expectations." As night fell, they parted ways, neither realizing the significance of their encounter. But fate wasn't done with them. A few days later, they ran into each other at a quaint coffee shop. Jane was waiting for her order when Gabriel walked in, looking equally surprised to see her. "You again?" Jane said with a small smile. "Do you always bump into strangers twice?" "Only the ones worth meeting twice," Gabriel replied, his charm catching Jane off guard. They ended up sharing a table, and before long, their tentative connection deepened. Jane found herself laughing for the first time in weeks, while Gabriel felt a sense of peace he hadn't known since his diagnosis. Neither of them wanted to acknowledge the unspoken bond growing between them, one built on shared pain, but also on an unexplainable understanding. Over the next few weeks, their paths continued to cross, each encounter drawing them closer. Gabriel, who had always been focused on his legacy and family name, began to see life differently through Jane's resilience. Jane, who felt abandoned and overwhelmed, found strength in Gabriel's unwavering presence. One evening, as they sat by the riverside, Gabriel looked at Jane and said, "I don't know what it is about you, but you remind me that there's still good in the world, even when everything feels so broken." Jane looked away, her heart heavy with secrets she couldn't share. "You've been through so much," she said, "but you're still standing. That says a lot about who you are." Their words hung in the air, heavy with meaning neither could fully grasp. Little did they know, their worlds were on the brink of colliding in ways they couldn't imagine. As their bond grew, so did the suspense. The truth about Jane's pregnancy, the hospital's mistake, and Gabriel's connection to it all loomed like a shadow over their newfound friendship. Yet for now, they remained in blissful ignorance, finding solace in each other's company. But secrets have a way of surfacing, and the truth would soon test everything they had built. Jane Rivers, once a promising college student, found her world unraveling as her pregnancy progressed. The once lively halls of her university now felt alien to her, filled with whispers and stares. The exhaustion of balancing schoolwork, a part-time job, and her growing belly became unbearable. Jane eventually decided to take a leave of absence, retreating to her parents' home in the hopes of finding clarity and support. Her mother, Elise, and Elise's partner, Sarah, did their best to make Jane feel comfortable. Yet the tension in the house was palpable. Elise was racked with worry about Jane's future, while Sarah took a more protective, almost defiant stance. She saw Jane as vulnerable and believed it was her duty to shield her from the harsh realities the world had thrown her way. Amidst the chaos, Gabriel Daniels found himself thinking about Jane more often than he expected. He didn't fully understand why he felt such a connection to her. Maybe it was her honesty, her resilience, or the way she carried a quiet strength even in her darkest moments. Whatever the reason, Gabriel couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that he needed to check on her. One afternoon, Gabriel decided to visit Jane. He found himself standing on the doorstep of her family's modest home, unsure of what he would say. Sarah answered the door, her expression immediately hardening at the sight of the unfamiliar man. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone sharp and unwelcoming. "I'm here to see Jane," Gabriel said, his voice calm but determined. I want to make sure she's doing okay." Sarah stepped outside, closing the door behind her. "Listen, I don't know who you are or what your intentions are, but Jane doesn't need any more stress in her life. She's been through enough." Gabriel hesitated. He didn't want to argue, but he couldn't walk away either. "I'm not here to cause trouble," he said earnestly. "I just want to be there for her, as a friend." Sarah's eyes narrowed. She doesn't need a friend right now. What she needs is peace. So whatever this is, it ends here. Stay away from my daughter. Gabriel clenched his jaw, his frustration mounting. "I'm not trying to hurt her. I care about her." Sarah crossed her arms, unmoved. "Care from a distance. Don't come back here." The door closed firmly behind her, leaving Gabriel standing alone on the porch. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. He wasn't sure what he had expected, but the confrontation left him feeling both helpless and determined. Despite Sarah's warning, Gabriel and Jane's paths continued to cross, albeit less frequently. They would occasionally meet in public places, parks, coffee shops, and once, even a library. Their conversations grew deeper, filled with unspoken truths and a budding connection neither could fully explain. Jane found solace in Gabriel's company. He didn't treat her like a fragile glass ready to shatter, nor did he bombard her with questions she couldn't answer. He simply listened, offering quiet encouragement when she needed it most. "I don't understand why you're so kind to me," Jane said one evening as they sat on a park bench. The autumn leaves rustled around them, painting the world in shades of gold and crimson. Gabriel looked at her, his expression thoughtful. "Because you deserve kindness, Jane. Life's been unfair to you. but that doesn't mean you have to face it alone." His words lingered in her heart, a beacon of hope in the midst of her confusion and fear. However, their growing bond didn't go unnoticed. Priska, who had been growing suspicious of Gabriel's long walks and late nights, decided to follow him one evening. She had been scrolling through his phone earlier that week and found nothing incriminating, but her gut told her there was more to the story. Dressed inconspicuously, Priska trailed Gabriel to a small cafe. Her heart pounded as she saw him sitting across from Jane, their heads bent close together in deep conversation. Priska's blood boiled as she watched the easy smiles and the way Gabriel's eyes softened when he looked at the younger woman. Who was she? And why was Gabriel spending so much time with her? Priska's mind raced with possibilities, each more infuriating than the last. She snapped a photo of them with her phone, her hands trembling with rage. That night, Priska couldn't sleep. Her mind replayed the scene at the cafe, each detail fueling her anger. How dare Gabriel betray her trust like this? And who was that girl to think she could steal him away? The next morning, Priska decided she needed answers, but confrontation wasn't her style. No, Priska preferred to play the long game. She would dig deeper, learn everything she could about Jane Rivers, and find a way to make her pay for whatever hold she had over Gabriel. Priska's obsession grew. She began stalking Jane online, piecing together bits of her life through social media and mutual connections. She even went as far as to hire a private investigator to gather more information. The more she learned, the more determined she became to bring Jane's world crashing down. Meanwhile, Jane remained blissfully unaware of Priska's scheming. Her focus was on navigating her pregnancy and the growing friendship she shared with Gabriel. But as the weeks turned into months, the cracks in their fragile peace began to show. To be continued. If you enjoyed this story and can't wait to see what happens next, make sure to subscribe to our channel for part 2. Don't forget to like this video and leave a comment below with your thoughts on Gabriel and Jane's journey. What do you think will happen when the truth finally comes out? Let us know. We'd love to hear from you.
Please tell me, are you enjoying the story? If so, tell me, what lessons have you actually learned? I would really love to hear your comments in the comment section down below. And remember to support this channel. Please subscribe, like the video, comment, just say something. Even a word could literally mean a whole lot. So I want you to tell me, what lessons have you learned from this story? Trust me, these are situations that most people actually gone through. I'm sure some of you that are watching this story have actually gone through this situation. So I want to hear from you. I want to hear how you dealt with the situation that you were faced with.
Jane sat in her room, staring at the ultrasound picture on her desk. The tiny, blurry image of the life growing inside her brought a mix of emotions: fear, confusion, and a strange, unshakable bond. Her mother's voice called from the kitchen, grounding her thoughts momentarily. "Jane, dinner's ready." Elise's tone carried the weight of someone trying to keep the pieces of a fractured family together. As Jane made her way to the dining table, she noticed the tense atmosphere. Elise was stirring a pot absent-mindedly, while Sarah set the table with an unusual firmness. Jacob sat silently, his scarred face unreadable, though his presence always felt like a reminder of the cost of misplaced trust. "Are you okay?" Jacob finally broke the silence as Jane sat down. His voice was soft, but his eyes bore into hers. Jane nodded. "I'm trying. It's just hard." Before Jacob could respond, Sarah cut in. "Hard doesn't begin to describe it. We need answers, Jane. We can't keep pretending this is normal." Jane's chest tightened. "I've told you everything I know. I don't have answers either." Elise shot Sarah a warning glance. "Let's not push her tonight." But the air in the room was heavy, and the tension was palpable. Jane excused herself early, retreating to her room where she felt safer, even if her thoughts refused to grant her peace. Across town, Gabriel Daniels sat in his dimly lit office, staring at his reflection in the glass window. His world felt like it was spinning out of control, and the only thing keeping him grounded was the memory of Jane's smile. It was inexplicable, the connection he felt with her, the pull he couldn't resist. But every time he thought about her, guilt crept in. He had a wife, a life he had built, yet this stranger had somehow become the center of his thoughts. The door to his office swung open, and Priska walked in, her red lips pressed into a thin line. "You're working late again," she said, her tone icy. Gabriel didn't look at her. "I've had a lot on my mind." Priska stepped closer, her heels clicking against the floor. "I bet you have." Her words dripped with venom, but Gabriel didn't bite. "Is there something you need, Priska?" he asked calmly, turning to face her. Priska smirked, crossing her arms. "Shouldn't I be asking you that? You seem to be finding solace elsewhere these days." Gabriel's jaw tightened. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Oh, don't play dumb," Priska snapped, pulling out her phone and showing him the photo she had taken at the cafe. "Who is she?" Gabriel's stomach dropped, but he kept his face neutral. "She's no one," he lied. Priska laughed bitterly. "No one? You look at her like she's the only thing keeping you alive. Don't insult my intelligence, Gabriel." "Drop it, Priska," Gabriel said, his voice low and dangerous. "You don't know what you're talking about." Priska leaned in closer, her eyes blazing. "Maybe not yet, but I will. Mark my words, Gabriel, I'll find out who she is and why you're so obsessed with her." Meanwhile, Jane sat in her room, scrolling through her messages. Stephanie had been her rock through this ordeal, but even she seemed to be growing distant. A text from her popped up. "You need to figure out who the father is, Jane. This isn't just going to go away." Jane sighed, her mind wandering back to Gabriel. He was the one person who made her feel less alone, even though she knew deep down she shouldn't rely on him. But how could she ignore the way he looked at her? Like he saw all the pieces of her she was too scared to show anyone else. The next morning, Gabriel couldn't resist. He found himself at the park where he and Jane often crossed paths. She was there, sitting on their usual bench, lost in thought. When she saw him, a small smile broke through her serious expression. "Hey," she said softly as he approached. "Hey," he replied, sitting beside her. "You look tired." Jane shrugged. "It's been a long week." Gabriel hesitated before speaking. "I don't know how to say this without overstepping, but I care about you, Jane, and I know you're going through something big. I just want you to know you're not alone." Jane's eyes filled with tears. "Why do you care so much? You barely know me." Gabriel took a deep breath. "I don't know, but I do, and I don't think I can just walk away." Jane looked at him, her heart pounding. She wanted to believe him, to trust him, but the weight of her secret held her back. "Thank you," she said quietly. "That means a lot." As they sat in silence, neither of them noticed the figure watching them from a distance. Priska stood behind a tree, her fists clenched and her mind racing. She wasn't just angry anymore, she was determined. If Gabriel wouldn't tell her the truth, she would find it herself. The tension in the air was suffocating, yet neither Jane nor Gabriel could completely detach from the strange comfort they found in each other. Their bond had grown deeper, but little did they know that a storm was brewing, one that would leave no part of their lives untouched. Meanwhile, Jane tried to make sense of her growing belly and the whirlwind of events that surrounded her. Her mother, Elise, and Sarah were more protective than ever, hovering around her like guards. But Jane felt isolated. No one truly understood what she was going through, not even Gabriel. Her best friend, Stephanie, was her only anchor. Over steaming mugs of hot chocolate in Jane's childhood bedroom, Stephanie whispered, "Have you thought about going back to the hospital? Maybe they made a mistake. Maybe... I don't know. There's some explanation for all of this." "I've thought about it," Jane admitted. But every time I try to call or even step near that place, I freeze. What if the truth is worse than the unknown? Stephanie took her hand. You have to face it, Jane. This isn't just about you anymore. You're carrying a life, a child. You deserve answers. But before Jane could muster the courage to uncover the truth, Priska was already one step ahead. Priska's obsession with Jane had grown into a dangerous fixation. Armed with the findings of her private investigator, she now knew Jane's name, her family background, and even the scandalous detail of her mysterious pregnancy. Priska smirked as she stared at the report. A pregnant college girl, unmarried and living with her two mothers? Oh, the irony. Gabriel's little charity project. But as she dug deeper, a horrifying realization hit her like a freight train. The dates didn't add up. Jane's pregnancy timeline perfectly matched the period when Gabriel and she had attempted surrogacy. Panic clawed at her chest. Could it be? Could Jane's child be Gabriel's? Priska's mind spiraled. If Gabriel found out, he'd never let her destroy Jane. Worse, he might leave her entirely. She couldn't let that happen. Not after everything she had sacrificed to stay by his side. She needed to take control, and fast. Priska decided to confront Jane directly, but instead of marching up to her door, she devised a more insidious plan. She crafted an anonymous letter filled with lies and half-truths and sent it to Elise. The letter claimed that Jane's pregnancy was the result of a secret affair and that the father was a married man who was already trying to cover his tracks. When Elise received the letter, her heart sank. Doubts crept into her mind. Was Jane keeping secrets from her? Was Sarah right to warn her against trusting Gabriel? Elise decided to confront her daughter that evening. Jane, Elise began, her voice trembling. I received this today. She slid the letter across the table. Jane's eyes widened as she read the contents. Her face turned pale, her hands shaking. This isn't true, she cried. Mom, I don't even know any married men. Sarah snatched the letter and read it aloud, her voice dripping with anger. This is absurd. It's just someone trying to stir trouble. Elise, you can't possibly believe this nonsense. But what if it's true? Elise whispered, tears welling in her eyes. What if we don't know the whole story? Jane bolted from the room, unable to handle the accusations. She ran to the park, the same park where she had first met Gabriel. And there he was, sitting on their usual bench, lost in thought. When Jane approached, her tears streaming down her face, Gabriel immediately stood up. Jane, what's wrong? They think I'm lying, she sobbed. My mom, my family, they think I've done something terrible. Gabriel pulled her into a comforting embrace. I believe you, he said softly. No matter what happens, I believe you. Unbeknownst to Jane and Gabriel, Priska's plot was already in motion. At the same time, Elise was pacing the living room floor, her mind racing. The letter had shaken her, but Sarah's words haunted her more. Sarah was calm now, sipping tea in the corner. You shouldn't have shown her the letter, she said quietly. It's not about the truth. It's about trust. Right now, Jane needs us to trust her. Elise stopped pacing. And what if we're trusting her at the expense of protecting her? What if whoever wrote this letter knows more than we do? Sarah raised an eyebrow. And what would you do? Hunt down this anonymous accuser? Or confront Gabriel? The name lingered in the air like a dark cloud. Gabriel. He had come into their lives so suddenly, so conveniently, just as Jane's pregnancy had begun to weigh her down emotionally. Elise bit her lip, recalling his polite manners, his way of making Jane laugh when no one else could. But Sarah was right. How much did they really know about him? And more importantly, what was he hiding? As night fell, Elise sat by the kitchen table, staring at the letter again. Her thoughts churned as she resolved to investigate Gabriel herself. Something didn't sit right, and she couldn't shake the feeling that Jane's safety, and the safety of her unborn grandchild might depend on the answers she found. That same night, while Elise wrestled with doubts and Jane sought solace with Gabriel, a storm was brewing at the hospital where Jane had first discovered her pregnancy. Nurse Priska, donning her fake identity with chilling precision, had embedded herself into the hospital's staff unnoticed. Her obsession with control and power had driven her to unimaginable lengths, and Jane's case had caught her eye. Priska had slipped into the hospital records room earlier that evening. Her heart raced as she typed Jane Rivers' patient ID into the system. Her fingers trembled when the screen revealed an unusual anomaly in the pregnancy reports. 2 files with conflicting dates, 2 fetuses registered under Jane Rivers' name. One file listed her pregnancy as normal, while the other referenced a mysterious surrogacy procedure. Priska's lips curled into a sinister smile. "So it's true," she muttered under her breath. Gabriel and Jane were connected in ways even they didn't fully understand. She quickly downloaded the files onto a USB stick and erased any traces of her access. Her next step was clear. She would confront Jane directly, not to expose the truth, but to manipulate it. Priska's plan wasn't just to drive a wedge between Gabriel and Jane, it was to destroy them both. As dawn broke, Jane woke with sharp, stabbing pains in her lower abdomen. Panic set in as the realization hit her. She was going into labor. She called out for her mother, her voice trembling with fear. Elise rushed into the room, her face pale. "We need to get you to the hospital now," she said, helping Jane to her feet. At the hospital, chaos ensued as doctors and nurses hurried to prepare for the delivery. Priska, now dressed in her nurse's uniform, watched from the corner of the room, her expression unreadable. Jane didn't recognize her, too consumed by pain and fear to notice the malice in Priska's eyes. As the hours passed, Jane's cries echoed through the hospital halls. Gabriel, who had been waiting anxiously in the lobby, pushed past the nurses and burst into the delivery room. "I'm here," he said, taking Jane's hand. "You're not alone." But Priska was ready for him. She stepped forward, her voice calm, yet filled with venom. "I don't think you're supposed to be here, Mr. Daniels. This is a family matter." Gabriel froze, his eyes narrowing. "Who are you?" Priska smiled. "I'm Nurse Priska. I've been assigned to Jane's case. And I have to say, it's fascinating how much you've been involved. Almost suspiciously so." Jane's grip on Gabriel's hand tightened as her contractions intensified. "What is she talking about?" she managed to gasp. Priska leaned in closer, her voice low and icy. "Oh, you haven't told her? How interesting. Maybe you'd like to explain why her pregnancy records list your name, Gabriel?" Gabriel's face turned ashen. "That's impossible," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Is it?" Priska countered, holding up the USB stick she had stolen. "Because I have all the proof right here."
If you made it to the end of part 2 of this thrilling story, then all I can say is congratulations and thank you. These videos really take a lot of time to make, but you guys' support really keep me going. Comments below and share this video with your friends and family. Also, like and subscribe to the channel so that you'll be the first to be notified when I drop a new video.
Elise briefly left the nursery to answer a phone call. Priska slipped inside. The baby, fast asleep in his crib, didn't stir as Priska gently lifted him into her arms. By the time Elise returned, the nursery was empty, and her heart dropped. "Jane!" she screamed, running through the house. "The baby's gone!" Elise sat at her kitchen table, the house silent except for the soft hum of the refrigerator. The letter about Jane's pregnancy and the accusations against Gabriel had unsettled her in a way she couldn't shake. Her instincts told her there was more to the story, and as Jane's mother, she couldn't stand idly by. She opened her laptop and began digging, starting with the hospital where Jane had delivered her baby. The process was slow and painstaking. Elise combed through public reviews, articles, and forums, looking for any hint of malpractice or scandals involving the hospital. She hit a breakthrough when she found an obscure post from a woman who had once worked as a nurse at the same facility. The post alluded to a history of errors in fertility treatments and poorly managed records. Elise's heart pounded as she continued her search, focusing on Gabriel's connection to the hospital. The name of the surrogacy clinic where Gabriel and Priska had arranged the procedure appeared repeatedly in her research. She managed to find a news article from years ago about a botched surrogacy case involving the same clinic. It mentioned the clinic's tendency to cut corners to save costs, leading to mix-ups. Elise knew she needed more. She visited the hospital in person, pretending to inquire about their fertility programs for a friend. While there, she overheard a nurse discussing missing records and became certain there was a cover-up. After days of digging, Elise finally pieced together the puzzle. Gabriel's sperm sample had been used in Jane's pregnancy due to a medical error. The realization hit her like a freight train. Her daughter had unknowingly been made a surrogate for a man she barely knew, and the hospital had tried to bury the evidence. Elise's heart broke as she sat across from Jane in their living room, holding the papers she had printed from her investigation. Jane was sitting on the couch, rocking her newborn son, his small body nestled against her chest. Elise took a deep breath. "Jane, we need to talk," she began, her voice trembling. Jane looked up, her face clouding with concern. "What's wrong, Mom?" Elise hesitated, then placed the papers on the table. "I've been looking into your pregnancy, the hospital, and Gabriel Daniels." Jane's brows furrowed as she adjusted the baby in her arms, then reached for the papers. Her face paled, and her hands began to shake. "What is this?" she whispered. Elise placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "It wasn't an accident, Jane. Gabriel's sperm was used in your pregnancy. There was a mix-up at the hospital. You were never supposed to carry his child." Tears welled in Jane's eyes as she tried to process the information. "So, this wasn't my choice. This wasn't me," she stammered, her voice breaking. "They used me, Mom. They used my body without my consent." Before Elise could respond, there was a knock at the door. It was Gabriel. Elise let him in reluctantly, her glare icy. Gabriel, sensing the tension, sat down across from Jane. "I need to explain," he said softly, glancing at the baby in her arms. Jane turned to him, her voice trembling with anger and pain. "You knew, didn't you? You knew, and you didn't tell me?" Gabriel shook his head. "I only just found out myself, Jane. The clinic made a mistake, and the hospital tried to cover it up. I never wanted this for you, for us. But now we're connected in a way I never expected." Jane's emotions erupted. "Connected? You think this is some kind of blessing? They used me, Gabriel. My life has been turned upside down because of this." Gabriel looked devastated. "I'm sorry, Jane. I'm so sorry. I'll do everything I can to make this right." But Jane couldn't bear to look at him anymore. She stormed out of the room, leaving Gabriel and Elise in silence. Meanwhile, Priska was unraveling. She had been following Gabriel's every move and had pieced together that Jane's baby was Gabriel's. Her jealousy and desperation consumed her. She refused to let a young single mother destroy her marriage and tarnish her social image. Priska hired a public relations firm and began feeding rumors to gossip blogs. The next morning, headlines splashed across social media. "Billionaire CEO caught in scandal. College girl claims he's the father." The articles painted Jane as a gold digger, a desperate young woman looking to exploit Gabriel's wealth and status. Anonymous sources described her as manipulative and claimed she had seduced Gabriel for financial gain. Priska, watching from her sleek penthouse, smirked as the public frenzy began. She knew how to control a narrative, and she planned to destroy Jane's credibility before Gabriel could fully connect with her. The effects of Priska's actions were immediate and brutal. Jane's phone buzzed incessantly with messages, some from strangers hurling insults, others from friends expressing disbelief. Her social media accounts were flooded with cruel comments, calling her names like gold digger and homewrecker. At her university, Jane was called into the dean's office. Despite her protests, the dean informed her that her enrollment was being terminated. "Your presence here is causing a distraction," he said coldly. "We can't have this kind of attention on our institution." Jane left the office in tears, her world crumbling around her. When she returned home, she found her family in turmoil. Neighbors whispered and avoided them, and her mother, Elise, received anonymous hate mail accusing her of raising a disgrace. Gabriel, furious at the media storm, tried to shield Jane by releasing a statement defending her character. But his efforts only fueled more speculation. Every attempt to help Jane seemed to backfire, leaving her feeling more isolated and humiliated. One night, as Jane sat in her childhood bedroom with her baby asleep in the crib, she broke down completely. Her once promising life as a college student now felt like a distant memory. "Why is this happening to me?" she whispered to herself, clutching a baby blanket. The world had turned against her, and she didn't know how much more she could take. Elise had never been one to back down when it came to protecting her daughter. After piecing together the truth about Jane's pregnancy, she decided it was time to confront Priska directly. Sarah, initially hesitant, eventually agreed to join her, knowing how volatile the situation could become. They tracked Priska to a high-end cafe where she frequently held her social gatherings. As Elise and Sarah stepped into the cafe, the polished decor and low hum of conversations contrasted sharply with the storm brewing inside Elise. Priska was seated in a corner, dressed impeccably in a tailored suit, sipping on a latte like she didn't have a care in the world. When she spotted Elise and Sarah approaching, her brow arched in mild annoyance. "Oh, what a surprise," Priska said, her tone dripping with mock politeness. "To what do I owe this pleasure?" Elise wasted no time. "We know what you've done," she said, her voice steady but laced with fury. "You've been spreading lies about my daughter, and you're the reason she's being dragged through the mud." Priska smirked, setting down her cup. "I only told the truth. If your daughter can't handle the spotlight, maybe she shouldn't have gotten herself into this situation." Sarah, unable to hold back, stepped forward. "You know damn well Jane didn't ask for any of this. The hospital made a mistake, and instead of helping to fix it, you've been trying to ruin her life." Priska's eyes darkened, her polite facade slipping. "Mistake or not, that child is a threat to my marriage and my life. Gabriel is mine. Everything he has is mine. I was protecting what's rightfully mine." Elise leaned forward, her voice sharp and unwavering. "Gabriel doesn't belong to you, and neither does that child. You don't get to play God with people's lives just because you're scared of losing your cushy lifestyle." Priska's smirk returned, but there was a flicker of vulnerability in her eyes. "You think you can come in here and lecture me? Gabriel and I built this life together. I won't let some college girl and her mistake of a baby take it away from me." The confrontation grew tense, voices rising as the other patrons began to take notice. Elise and Sarah left after making one thing clear. They weren't going to let Priska's lies and manipulation go unchallenged. Priska, though shaken, resolved to protect her crumbling world at any cost. Gabriel, growing tired of the accusations and uncertainty, decided it was time to settle the matter once and for all. He arranged for a DNA test to confirm whether he was the father of Jane's baby. Jane, though hesitant, agreed. It was better to have the truth than to live in the shadow of doubt. Priska, however, was not about to let the test proceed smoothly. She bribed a lab technician to falsify the results, hoping to plant further doubt about Gabriel's connection to the baby. But her plan didn't account for Gabriel's vigilance. Suspecting that Priska might try to interfere, he hired an independent lab to handle the testing. The day of the test was fraught with tension. Jane sat in the waiting room with her baby in her arms, avoiding Gabriel's gaze. Elise and Sarah were by her side, offering quiet support. Priska arrived unexpectedly, her presence sending a ripple of unease through the room. She sat down across from Jane, her expression smug. "Good luck," she said, her voice low but cutting. "You're going to need it." Gabriel ignored Priska's provocations, focusing on Jane and the baby. "No matter what happens," he said softly to Jane, "I'm here for you." A week later, the results came in. Gabriel insisted on gathering everyone involved, Jane, Elise, Sarah, and even Priska, so there would be no room for manipulation or denial. The air was thick with tension as the lab technician handed Gabriel the sealed envelope. Gabriel's hands trembled slightly as he opened it. His eyes scanned the paper, and a wave of emotion washed over him. "It's confirmed," he said, his voice choked with both relief and disbelief. "I'm the father." Elise and Sarah exchanged glances, their protective instincts for Jane heightened. Jane, holding her baby tightly, felt a mix of emotions she couldn't untangle. Relief that the truth was out. Anger at how her life had been upended. Fear for what the future might hold. Gabriel, overwhelmed, turned to Jane. "I don't know how to put this into words, but this means everything to me. I know this isn't what you wanted, and I can't change what happened, but I promise I'll do everything I can to be the father this child deserves." Jane didn't respond right away. Her mind raced, torn between her growing respect for Gabriel and the resentment she still harbored over the circumstances of her pregnancy. Priska, meanwhile, sat silently, her carefully constructed world beginning to crumble around her. A few days later, Gabriel asked to meet Jane privately. They met at a park, the same park where their connection had first begun. Gabriel seemed more nervous than usual, his typically composed demeanor replaced with a rare vulnerability. "Jane," he began, sitting beside her on the bench as she cradled her son. "I've been thinking a lot about what comes next, about what's best for you, for the baby, and for me." Jane glanced at him warily. "What are you saying?" Gabriel took a deep breath. "I'm not asking for anything you're not ready to give. I just want us to find a way to do this together. Not as a couple, necessarily, but as co-parents. I want to be part of his life, Jane. And I want to support you, however I can." Jane's grip on her son tightened. "Gabriel, this is all so complicated. I don't even know where to start." "I know," Gabriel said, his voice gentle. "But I don't want to force anything. I just want to be here, for you and for him. And if, down the line, we find a way to be more than co-parents, then great. But if not, that's okay too." Jane looked at him, tears welling in her eyes. She wanted to say no, to protect herself and her son from the chaos Gabriel's presence might bring. But deep down, she saw the sincerity in his eyes, the determination to make things right. "I'll think about it," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Gabriel nodded, a flicker of hope in his expression. "That's all I ask." As they sat in silence, watching the sun dip below the horizon, Jane felt the weight of her decision. Her future, and her son's, was tied to Gabriel in ways she hadn't yet begun to understand. The scandal surrounding Jane's pregnancy had become too large to ignore, and under mounting pressure from the public and Gabriel's legal team, the hospital launched an internal investigation. The management brought in an external auditing team to review records, interview staff, and uncover the truth about how the surrogacy process had gone so disastrously wrong. The investigation revealed shocking negligence. It was discovered that a senior doctor, Dr. Benson, had rushed through several procedures that day due to an overbooked schedule. Instead of following proper protocols, he had delegated critical responsibilities to junior staff, leading to the catastrophic mix-up that resulted in Jane being impregnated with Gabriel's sperm. When questioned, Dr. Benson admitted to being overworked, but also revealed that the hospital had encouraged cutting corners to maintain profits. The findings caused an uproar. The hospital's reputation was in tatters, and Dr. Benson was immediately terminated. The hospital's administration issued a public apology to Jane and Gabriel, but it did little to quell the outrage. Jane, while relieved that the truth had finally come out, still felt the weight of her violated autonomy. Gabriel promised her he would do everything in his power to hold the hospital accountable and secure compensation for her. Gabriel files for divorce. Amid the chaos, Gabriel's marriage to Priska had reached its breaking point. Her jealousy, manipulation, and recent actions had only confirmed what he had been trying to ignore for years. Their relationship was toxic and irreparable. Gabriel had tried to make their marriage work, but Priska's refusal to take accountability and her obsession with control made it impossible. One evening, Gabriel called Priska into his office at home. She entered with her usual air of confidence, dressed impeccably, but the tension in her posture betrayed her unease. Gabriel sat behind his desk, a stack of papers in front of him. "We need to talk," he began, his voice calm but firm. Priska crossed her arms, her lips curving into a bitter smile. "Let me guess. This is about that girl and her baby again." Gabriel shook his head. "This isn't about Jane or the baby. This is about us. Priska, I can't do this anymore." Her smile faltered. "What do you mean you can't do this?" "I've filed for divorce," Gabriel said, sliding the papers toward her. "It's over, Priska." Her eyes widened in shock, but it quickly turned to fury. "You're leaving me? For her?" "This isn't about her," Gabriel replied evenly. "This is about us. Our marriage has been falling apart for years, and you know it. I've tried to fix things, but you've made it clear that you care more about control and appearances than about us as a couple." Priska's hands trembled as she picked up the papers. "You think you can just walk away? After everything we've built together? After everything I've sacrificed for you?" Gabriel stood, his expression resolute. "This isn't up for debate. I'll make sure you're financially taken care of, but I'm done living in a marriage that's built on lies and manipulation." Priska stormed out of the room, slamming the door behind her. But as she left, a dark plan began to form in her mind. If Gabriel thought he could leave her so easily, he was sorely mistaken. Priska's revenge. Priska's anger and desperation consumed her. The divorce was not just an end to her marriage, it was a public humiliation, a loss of power and status she couldn't bear. She needed leverage to force Gabriel back into her life, and she knew exactly what to do. One night, while Jane and her baby were staying at Elise's house, Priska made her move. Disguised in a dark hoodie and sunglasses, she snuck onto the property and waited for her chance. When Elise briefly left the nursery to answer a phone call, Priska slipped inside. The baby, fast asleep in his crib, didn't stir as Priska gently lifted him into her arms. By the time Elise returned, the nursery was empty, and her heart dropped. "Jane!" she screamed, running through the house. "The baby's gone!" Jane rushed in, her face pale with terror. "What do you mean he's gone?" A note was left on the crib, written in Priska's neat, cold handwriting. "If Gabriel wants his son back, he knows where to find me."
We have one more amazing episode to go. If you've enjoyed the story so far, please drop a comment below. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the bell notification so you won't miss any updates.
Sarah's stomach tightened. "And what have you been thinking?" Elise looked at her, her expression conflicted. "I've spent so many years believing that love wasn't worth the risk. I saw what it did to my parents, how my father treated my mother. I promised myself I'd never put myself in a position to be hurt like that." Sarah's face softened. "But we've built a life together, Elise. We've loved each other through everything." Elise nodded, tears glistening in her eyes. "We have, and I'll always be grateful for you, Sarah. You've been my rock. But Watching Gabriel with Jane, seeing how he's willing to change for her, for their child, it's made me realize something. I've been holding myself back from love in a way I didn't even understand until now. Sarah's expression darkened. "What are you saying?" Elise took a deep breath, her voice trembling. "I met someone. It wasn't planned, and I didn't go looking for it." The farmhouse sat in the middle of nowhere, cloaked in shadows under the pale moonlight. The crunch of gravel beneath the tires was the only sound as Gabriel, Elise, and the police arrived. Their breaths were heavy with anticipation and fear, their hearts pounding as they prepared to face the unknown. Gabriel clenched his fists, his mind racing with images of his child in Priska's hands. Elise stepped out of the car, her resolve unshaken despite the anxiety in her eyes. She exchanged a look with Gabriel, a silent promise that they would bring the baby home. The officers moved with calculated precision, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. The farmhouse loomed ahead, its windows dark except for a faint flicker of light from one room. "That must be it," Elise whispered, her voice trembling. Gabriel nodded, his jaw tight. "We're not leaving without him." The lead officer motioned for silence as they approached the door. He tested the handle. It was locked. With a nod, another officer moved forward, a crowbar in hand. The door gave way with a loud crack, and the team stormed inside. The air inside the farmhouse was thick, the smell of mildew and neglect almost overpowering. The officers fanned out, checking each room. Gabriel stayed close to Elise, his eyes darting around for any sign of Priska or the baby. A faint cry broke the silence. Gabriel's heart lurched. "Upstairs!" one of the officers called out, and they all rushed to the source of the sound. In a small, dimly lit room, Priska sat in a rocking chair, holding the baby. Her face was calm, almost serene, but her eyes betrayed her instability. She looked up as they entered, a twisted smile on her lips. "You're too late," she said, her voice eerily calm. "This child doesn't belong to you." Gabriel stepped forward, his voice firm but trembling. "Give me my son." Priska's grip on the baby tightened. "Your son? You didn't even know he existed until I showed you the truth. You don't deserve him." "Let him go," Elise said, her voice steady despite the fear in her chest. "He's just a baby. Don't hurt him." Priska's eyes flicked to Elise, her expression unreadable. For a moment, she seemed to falter, the weight of her delusions cracking under the pressure. But then her resolve hardened. "You think you're better than me? None of you deserve him." The lead officer stepped forward, his voice calm but commanding. "Priska, it's over. Put the baby down." Priska's gaze darted around the room, realizing she was cornered. Her breaths quickened, and for a moment, Gabriel thought she might do something reckless. But then Elise stepped forward, her hands raised in a gesture of peace. "Priska," Elise said gently, her voice soft but firm. "You've been hurt. I can see that. But this isn't the way. Let the baby go, and we can talk about how to help you." Priska's lips trembled, her grip on the baby loosening ever so slightly. Gabriel held his breath, ready to spring forward if she showed any sign of harming his son. Finally, Priska broke. Tears streamed down her face as she handed the baby to Elise, her body shaking with sobs. The officers moved in quickly, restraining her as she collapsed to the floor, her cries echoing through the room. Gabriel rushed to Elise, his hands trembling as he reached for his child. The baby let out a small wail but calmed instantly as Gabriel held him close, his heart swelling with a mix of relief and love. Elise placed a hand on Gabriel's shoulder, her own tears streaming down her face. "He's safe," she whispered. "We did it." Priska was led away in handcuffs, her cries fading into the night. Gabriel and Elise stood in the room, the weight of the ordeal settling over them. But for the first time in weeks, there was a glimmer of hope. Priska was led away in handcuffs, her cries fading into the night. Gabriel and Elise stood in the room, the weight of the ordeal settling over them. But for the first time in weeks, there was a glimmer of hope. The days that followed were a whirlwind for Jane. When Gabriel returned home with his baby, she broke down, holding him close and promising never to let anything come between them again. But as the adrenaline faded, she realized her journey was far from over. Jane enrolled in online classes, determined to finish her degree. Balancing her studies with motherhood was no small feat, but she tackled it with unwavering determination. Every late-night feeding, every hour spent studying with her son sleeping in her arms was a testament to her resilience. Her experience with Priska ignited a fire within her. She started a blog, sharing her story and advocating for women's rights. Her posts quickly gained traction, and soon she was a voice for young mothers, survivors of medical malpractice, and anyone who felt powerless. Gabriel was a changed man. The ordeal had shaken him to his core, forcing him to confront his mistakes and take responsibility. He began attending therapy to address his guilt and started volunteering at organizations that supported single mothers and children in need. He also became an active part of Jane and the baby's life. From late-night diaper changes to attending parenting classes, he threw himself into fatherhood with a passion that surprised even himself. His bond with Jane deepened, built on mutual respect and a shared love for their son. Their relationship evolved slowly, each moment building on the last. They found comfort in co-parenting, their shared responsibilities bringing them closer. Gabriel often stayed late after putting the baby to bed, sharing quiet conversations with Jane about their hopes and fears. One evening, as they sat on the couch, Jane looked at Gabriel and smiled. "Thank you," she said softly. "For what?" he asked, surprised. "For being here," she replied. "For staying." Gabriel reached for her hand, his touch gentle. "I'll always be here, Jane, for both of you." Elise and Sarah had built a life together on a foundation of shared values, respect, and love. For years, they had raised Jane as a united front, navigating the challenges of being a same-sex couple in a society that wasn't always kind. But their relationship wasn't without its cracks, small fractures they had both ignored in the name of family and duty. After Priska's arrest and the rescue of Jane's baby, Elise began to change. It started subtly. She grew quieter during their usual evening conversations, spent more time away from home, and seemed distracted even when she was present. Sarah noticed but tried to brush it off, convincing herself that Elise was simply processing the trauma of recent events in her own way. One evening, as they sat at the dinner table after putting the baby to sleep, Sarah decided to address the growing distance. "You've been different lately," Sarah said carefully, her voice tinged with concern. "Is something on your mind?" Elise hesitated, her fork hovering over her plate. "I've just been thinking a lot," she admitted. "About everything. Jane, the baby, our family, my life." Sarah's stomach tightened. "And what have you been thinking?" Elise looked at her, her expression conflicted. "I've spent so many years believing that love wasn't worth the risk. I saw what it did to my parents, how my father treated my mother. I promised myself I'd never put myself in a position to be hurt like that." Sarah's face softened. "But we've built a life together, Elise. We've loved each other through everything." Elise nodded, tears glistening in her eyes. "We have, and I'll always be grateful for you, Sarah. You've been my rock. But watching Gabriel with Jane, seeing how he's willing to change for her, for their child, it's made me realize something. I've been holding myself back from love in a way I didn't even understand until now." Sarah's expression darkened. "What are you saying?" Elise took a deep breath, her voice trembling. "I met someone. It wasn't planned, and I didn't go looking for it. But he makes me feel something I didn't know I was missing." The room fell silent, the weight of Elise's words crashing down like a tidal wave. Sarah's heart ached, a sharp pain she hadn't expected. "How long Sarah finally asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's new," Elise said quickly. "I haven't done anything behind your back, Sarah, I wouldn't, but I can't ignore how I feel. It's made me realize that maybe we're not meant to be together anymore." Sarah pushed back her chair and stood, her hands trembling. "After everything we've been through, Elise? After all these years, you're just walking away?" Elise's own tears spilled over now. "I'm not walking away from you, Sarah. I'm walking towards something I've never allowed myself to believe in. I've lived my whole life being guarded, afraid to trust anyone the way I saw my mother trust my father, but I'm ready to let that go." Sarah clenched her fists, the hurt bubbling up into anger. "And what about me, Elise? Do you think I didn't trust you? That I didn't love you enough? Or is this just about you deciding you want something else?" Elise shook her head, her voice breaking. "This isn't about you not being enough. You've been everything to me. But I can't keep pretending I don't feel this pull towards something new. It's not fair to you." For weeks, Sarah struggled to come to terms with Elise's decision. She poured herself into caring for Jane and the baby to distract herself from the pain. But late at night, when the house was quiet, she couldn't escape the memories of the life she and Elise had built together. The betrayal stung deeply, not just because Elise had found someone else, but because she had redefined their love as something less than it once was. "She was my safe place," Sarah confided in Jane one evening as they sat in the living room. "And now I feel like I never really knew her at all." Jane placed a hand on her mother's. "It's not about you, Mom. You've given her everything. But maybe she needs to figure out who she is, too. That doesn't take away what you had together." Sarah nodded, but the ache in her chest remained. Elise, meanwhile, began seeing Maxwell, a kind and thoughtful man she had met through her work. Maxwell was patient and understanding, giving Elise the space to process her own emotions while gently encouraging her to embrace vulnerability. Their relationship blossomed slowly, but Elise found herself smiling more, feeling lighter. For the first time, she allowed herself to believe in love without fear of losing herself in it. Elise eventually shared the news with Jane, who was initially hesitant but supportive. "I just want you to be happy, Mom," Jane said. "And if Maxwell gives you that, then I'm glad." The final conversation between Elise and Sarah was bittersweet. They sat across from each other at the kitchen table, the silence between them heavy with unspoken words. "I want you to know," Elise began, "that I'll always love you, Sarah. What we had wasn't a mistake. You helped me raise an incredible daughter, and I'll never forget that." Sarah nodded, tears brimming in her eyes. "I'll always love you too, Elise, but I need time to figure out who I am without you." Elise reached across the table, placing her hand over Sarah's. "Take all the time you need. You deserve happiness, Sarah. Don't let this stop you from finding it." Though their relationship as partners ended, Elise and Sarah remained close, bound by their shared love for Jane and her son. They navigated family gatherings and holidays with grace, their bond transforming into a deep friendship. Sarah found strength in her independence, eventually rediscovering joy in her work and her role as a grandmother. Elise, with Rachel by her side, embraced the love she had once been too afraid to pursue. And though their paths had diverged, Elise and Sarah remained united in their commitment to supporting Jane and her family, proving that love, even when it changes, can endure.